So my name is Danielle Deibler. I work with Quad9. I'm going to talk a little bit about who Quad9 is and a little bit about how we view kind of the current state of DNS privacy. So I'm going to jump right into it. I want to thank Frank for putting this together. 2 weeks is not a lot of time to plan an event with this many speakers. So kudos on that one. So Quad9, if you don't know who we are, and let me it's really distracting to have somebody at you. Okay, when you're actually doing a presentation. Quad9 is a open resolver with an integrated threat feed. We are a not-for-profit, so we don't really have a commercial aspect to us. We operate in about 178 cities, and that goes over about 95 countries. The integrated threat feed is made up of 20 threat feeds that are given to us by various threat intelligence providers. It averages about 2 million domains a day, and we do about 600 blocking events per second. We have a varied user demographic, and I have a feeling that this might be why we were asked to talk about privacy, because we have a varied user demographic that we literally know absolutely nothing about. So we know that people use us because they talk about us on Reddit, or they send us support tickets, or sometimes they'll do press releases where they talk about they use us, but we don't actually have a direct customer relationship, and we don't collect any personally identifiable information about any of the users on our entire network. But occasionally we do get people who will share information with us. So a little kind of data point on our side, we have a provider who does security services, primarily focused on residential and small medium business endpoints. They did a sample in May of 2021 and found that 34% of their endpoints had at least one incident. And an incident for us means they tried to access a domain that was a command and control botnet, a phishing network, a malware distribution center, a stalkerware site. We only do cybersecurity threats. We don't do any content filtering. And now I am going to get into kind of the overall privacy. So I think DNS has been this core technology, right, for the functioning of the modern internet, but it evolved at this relatively slow pace for about 35 years. So this is Frank's video, right, which is very well done in like 2 slides, right? And 2 graphics. DOT and DNSCrypt were out there, and a few people were even thinking about encryption. But DNSSEC existed, but it didn't have wide implementation. And a lot of people didn't even know what DNS was, much less how to change your DNS settings. Now it's more about kind of the Wild West. So it's not necessarily, completely crazy, but there is a lot of stuff out there, right? There is, Odo and DOE and, all of these new RFCs that are coming out, and everybody now is really interested in not just encryption, but also privacy, right? The kind of understanding that plethora of data collection that's going on around DNS queries, because they have historically been unencrypted. And also there's a lot more in the regulatory environment that's going on right now. Like lawmakers in a lot of countries are actually starting to understand not just DNS, but that the internet has privacy implications. I am not going to talk deep on these protocols. Frank is going to talk later on anonymized DNS. Chris is going to talk on Odo, Mike on Handshake. Alex is going to talk about Tor. From a Quad9 perspective, we don't really have a horse in the race, right? We want implementations, right, so that we can run them on our network with a wide group of users, and we want to be able to benefit our users. We want to make sure that the choices that are made and the protocols that are adopted are the most beneficial from an end user perspective and an overall security perspective from an internet. All right, so personally, and I think this is a Quad9 thing as well, DNS privacy does not equal encryption to me. It's about 3 basic things. It's about implementation, right, which could be confidentiality via encryption. It's about users having the ability to have some control over what it is that they actually implement, and having some education on that as well. It's about jurisdiction, right? It's what kind of end user protection is available, what type of enforcement is there, what type of regulation is there, even some things like what's the political environment that you're deploying into. And understanding what DNS might be used for in that environment, and whether or not that syncs up with your business or your personal feelings. And then it's about policy. And that policy is typically going to be things like data collection, how you store that data, how you share that data, how long you store that data, and also what you use that data for internally. So from my perspective, I'm going to talk a little bit about each one of these more in relation to us, just to give you guys some stats and some understanding of what we're seeing in terms of implementation, jurisdiction, and policy. So encrypted breakdown, this is from a single host over 24 hours on our network. So a single host is a VM, and within a location that we have. So we see roughly, I'll go through these numbers with you. Roughly, so we see DNS over TLS at about an average of 120 queries per second. We see DOE at about an average of 110 queries per second. Remember, this is a single host. These numbers are from 2 days ago. And then we see DNS Crypt coming in at around 3 queries per second, and it's a 3-to-1 matchup there on UDP versus TCP. So UDP is strongly preferred for the DNS Crypt users that we see. And that's to compare that, our breakdown in terms of our actual unencrypted DNS traffic is, that same node sees kind of an average of around 5,000 queries per second. So you don't necessarily, encryption is not the main form of traffic, and that does ebb and flow. Occasionally we'll have, if I showed you numbers on the encrypted traffic maybe from a month and a half ago, you would have seen it about double. And that's because browser people pointed us and other people pointed us for periods of time, and then they do a bursty test and then it comes off. And that's just kind of the byproduct of being an open resolver. We also turned off TLS 1.1, or we're looking at 1.1 and 1.0 last year, and we wanted to make sure that we didn't have a bunch of people who were connecting to us using that. And that's primarily because we serve a lot of second and third world nations and emerging markets, and that means that sometimes people have really old versions of a phone, for instance, that has older support, and so we tend to support older technology potentially a little bit longer than a commercial company might. So what we saw in October of 2020 was about 20% of the connections we were getting were 1.2, and about almost 80% were 1.3. Now we're seeing about 12% are 1.2, and about 88% are 1.3. So that gives us some hope that maybe we can actually, turn something else off eventually, like in the next year or two. So we are seeing some pretty good uptake of TLS 1.3. Then I'm going to move into kind of jurisdiction. So earlier this year, we moved our main foundation to Switzerland. We figured if we were going to talk the talk in terms of privacy, we should walk the walk. But really, when you're looking at privacy, and some of it is going to be regulatory, right? So you have to consider the regulatory and the enforcement environment in that particular area. No matter what the jurisdiction is, you need to know the rules and take them into account for the things that you're going to create and the things that you're going to build. And that includes things like software. Because if you build something that's completely closed into one kind of set of privacy rules and regulations, you may not be able to expand that out and grow it globally. So we obviously went for a place where we feel like has the strongest end user privacy laws. So just a quick overview of that. Article 13 is part of the Swiss Constitution. It talks directly about online communications, email, and the processing of personal data. That's a big deal, considering that some people have constitutions that don't take into account technology at all. Then the DPA is the Federal Act on Data Protection in Switzerland. It's very close to what GDPR is, which people that are from the EU are probably familiar with. The biggest issue is it reaches a little bit further than Swiss territory. Its scope is larger than the constitutional amendment that they have, and it provides protections from foreign companies misusing the data of Swiss citizens, and also prevents Swiss companies from mishandling users' personal information. So it has kind of that global scope. And recently, it's been aligned more with GDPR, so that they're more compatible with one another. So this is, if you want to say you are best in the world in terms of at least the privacy jurisdiction that you're in, Switzerland we feel like is kind of the place to be at. But there are definitely other jurisdictions that are fantastic. So data collection, that's kind of the last piece of this. And I look at this a lot like product development. So the bottom line is, if you can, just don't collect any data. Unfortunately, that isn't necessarily possible. Sometimes you need data to debug something, right? Sometimes you need data to mitigate a DDoS. So some data is required to operate any type of a service or any type of a piece of software. You need to get some feedback. You need to know who's using it, or something about people who are using it, and something about how that usage happens. This is what we do internally. So we do an internal justification, right, of use cases, and this happens whether we get a request, say, like from a partner or a threat intelligence provider. We get a really deep understanding of what the use case is for the data that we're going to collect. And then, just like you kind of create an MVP, but maybe kind of in reverse, you try to minimize the amount of data that you collect for something. And if you have those deep use cases, you understand what adding one field to a JSON blob does, right? You know how much more information somebody gets from that. And so it's really, really important to, if you're going to collect data, understand what you're using it for, be transparent about it internally and externally, and be rigid about whether you're going to add a field, because even that one field can be something that will release additional PII around an end user. And then transparency, public policies, and simple to understand examples. I'm sure everyone here has read a privacy policy that literally, makes your eyes roll and glaze over a little bit, and you have no idea really what they're allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do. It would be great if you want to participate kind of in this privacy space, tell people, give them a real world example, right? And maybe even a real world and a techie example, because it might be the techie that's really reading your privacy policy, or just share the data that you share about people so that people understand what's really being shared with partners or even used internally for debugging or making your service better. And then I'm going to share an example here for us. So we exchange data with threat intelligence providers as a way to kind of make cybersecurity better, help them enrich the information that they have about domains that they believe are malicious. And for each hit to our block list, we return, an ID for a record, the domain that was queried, the Q-tape, a timestamp, the city, the region, and the country. And then, but even then, even the fields that you return, you should really be taking a look at, because even with things like city, you can disclose information. If 532 people live in a rural area, you're getting a lot closer to who that person is. So what we do is we don't disclose region if it's a population center of less than 10,000 people. So think about things like that when you're developing these policies and you're sharing data. Anyway, I think that is it. I'm done. If you have questions, add them into the questions channel. And if you don't, then thank you very much for your time.